Today is day 5,486 that Boswell's been here and been in business. We're glad to have you. Thank you. Tonight, our conversationalist is Christina Clancy. She's, of course, the author of The Second Home, author of Shoulder Season. She's a UWM PhD grad, Wisconsin native, just a general wonderful friend of Boswell. So thank you for your conversationalizing. And she will be here to chat with Rowan Beaird. Here with her debut novel, The Divorcées, her writings appeared in the Kenyon Review, the Southern Review, the Common, and others. She's the recipient of Plowshare's Emerging Writer Award. I'm adding S's to things. She's been a Bread Loaf and Story Studio scholar and of The Divorcées. Someone hold it up, please. The critics are saying, here are words the critics are using for this book. Delicious, fierce, rollicking, poignant, anticipated, disorienting, unforgettable, moody, mysterious, sexy, sparkling, wise, incisive, compassionate, tender, masterful, intriguing, tense, impressive, twisty, fascinating, moving, stunning, dark, rich, sultry, seductive. It is a knockout. Also, wonderful note, both Christopher Castellani and Boswell's own Daniel Goldin compare this book quite favorably to Patricia Highsmith, and what higher praise could you ask than that? So please welcome them.
An amazing introduction.
I love the word conversationalist.
Yes.
I kind of want that title on my bio.
Do it.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. And I'm so thrilled to be talking to Rowan. It's so funny that before I was telling Rowan before her book came out, everyone was sending me links to it, or sending me pictures of the cover. And I was like, what is it about this book that's so me that makes people think that this is similar to my book? And I was writing a book about a marriage. And so I thought maybe that was it. But then as I was reading, I was thinking one of my second book was called The Shoulder Season, and it was set in an old Playboy resort. And I was like, this is so much like Shoulder Season because it's all these women together in this institution and dealing with men and, and their freedom or lack thereof. So it was really fun to read this book. And I'm so excited to meet you, especially you're a fellow Midwesterner.
Yes. Yeah.
So thanks for coming to Boswell.
Oh my gosh. Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you for being here, and thank you for being my conversationalist.
Yes. I'm not your conversation partner.
Yes.
I'm your conversationalist.
Conversationalist.
So I know that one thing, so my mom is here, and one time I did an event with somebody and it was on Zoom. My mom watched it from home, and I got to her house afterwards and I said, Mom, what did you think? And she said, honey, I have no idea what that book was about. And I was like, what? I thought I did such a good job. So it's really nice to have a mother to keep you honest. And now she's here. So one of the things it was great actually that you said that, because when I am a conversationalist, one thing I really like to make sure I ask is what your book is about. And I have a two-pronged question. So first, I was going to ask you what your book is about to give the elevator pitch.
Great. All right. So elevator pitch for The Divorcées. The Divorcées is set in 1951. And it's about this very sheltered young woman from Lake Forest, Illinois, named Lois Saunders. And she journeys to one of Reno's famous divorce ranches to separate from her husband. And while there, she becomes obsessed with this mysterious, glamorous fellow guest named Greer Lang, who both offers Lois a new life, but also threatens the freedom that she really craves. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we ready for the second part?
So
I know this is like your PhD exam. But actually, at my press, one of the editors there said when you're writing a book, there are two things. There's what your book is about, then there's what your book is really about. So now maybe you can answer the question: what is your book really about?
I'd say the book is really about female friendship and desire, and it's in many ways an exploration of sort of all of the roles that we play while we're really trying to figure out who we are.
Very good.
Oh, thank you.
Mom, are you happy? Okay. My work here is done. See you later.
Yeah, exactly. Bye.
So can you maybe talk about just the genesis of this story? I always love hearing the origin story of a book. Like, how did this come into your mind and start taking root?
Yes. So the idea for The Divorcées actually came to me on my bachelorette weekend in Las Vegas. Yep. My husband loves that I was thinking deeply about divorce on the precipice of marrying him. But the reason is that in Las Vegas, we went to this place called the Neon Museum, which I don't know if anybody's ever been or heard of it. It's basically this like graveyard of old Las Vegas neon signs on the outskirts of the city. So it's really cool. And we had this really amazing tour guide who kind of had her own troubled love life that she was telling us about. And she at some point said, well, everybody knows that in Las Vegas, you get married, and in Reno, you get divorced. And I raised my hand because I was like, what are you talking about? You know, I've heard that about Las Vegas. I think everybody has, but I've never heard that about Reno. And she told us sort of a brief overview of divorce law in the state of Nevada, which is that in 1931, to help recover from the Great Depression, they made two really important decisions. So one, they legalized gambling, which we all know Nevada for. And they also changed their divorce residency requirements so that if you were to move to the state for just 6 weeks, you could separate from your spouse for pretty much any reason. And this was really radical at the time, you know, like in New York, for example, as a point of comparison, you could really only separate from your spouse if they committed adultery. You needed proof of that adultery. Even then, the judge could still say no. So as a result, Reno, because it was already a tourist destination, it became the divorce capital of the country. And she mentioned offhand the existence of divorce ranches where the Divorcées is set. And basically, if you went to Reno and you were amongst the rich or the famous, you would stay at a ranch. And these ranches, you know, catered to women from the upper class. Women would spend their days swimming in swimming pools and learning to ride horses. They'd spend their evenings gambling at casinos, and many had affairs with cowboys. And, you know, famous actresses like Rita Hayworth and Maureen O'Hara went to these places. And so I was, of course, just a little entranced by the glamour of that setting. I mean, who would not be? But I also just loved the idea of all of these women at a true crisis point in their own life, like a true point of metamorphosis, all being under one roof together.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a drink, or it's a barbiturate, right? Limonal.
Yeah, luminol.
Luminol.
Yes.
Can you tell me? I actually kind of Googled it, but I didn't have a lot of time to like do a deep dive on luminol. But
Yeah.
I have a reason for asking that.
Yeah.
So I just need to remember to figure circle back.
Yeah. So it's basically kind of like an early sedative. So it's something that was prescribed to women during that time if they had, you know, sort of a mood disorder or a nervous disorder, like one of the characters might.
Oh, well, the reason I was asking is because while I was reading your book, I was thinking about liminality, which in literature, a liminal state is when you're between things. You're not one thing or the other. And the example I love is like, you know, a butterfly, you know, when it's moving from being a caterpillar to a butterfly, there's a certain state in the middle where it's really nothing. It's shed one identity, but it hasn't yet assumed the next identity. And I was thinking that all of literature, my favorite stories are really about characters in a liminal point in their lives, because that's when people are the most interesting. You know, they're thinking about taking things on. And as I was reading your book, I thought this is one of the most liminal books I've ever read, because these women go to this place with the they, you know, they're losing one identity. They want to take on another identity, but taking on another identity can be pretty hard too. I think that you write about some, you know,
of course.
Were you thinking about that as you were writing?
Oh, definitely. And I think that's why the setting was so fascinating to me, because I mean, one, it's just, you know, the nuts and bolts of what a divorce ranch is. It really is where you're waiting out this period of time when you're transitioning from being a wife to no longer being a wife. And then, of course, there's the time period of the 1950s when a lot of the paths that are open to women today really weren't open to them. And so when they're spending these 6 weeks in Reno, it's trying to figure out, okay, I'm shedding this skin. I'm not this person anymore, but who can I possibly be? You know, what does the future look like beyond the desert?
And I think that's one of the great dramatic questions of the novel.
Yeah.
It's what's going to happen once these ladies get out, and what can happen for them given all the limitations. I was reading in the New York Times, Beatrice Williams wrote a review of the book, and she started out with a quote I've thought about quite a bit. It was really moving. She said that her grandmother had said that women were having fun and like things were looking great for women in the 20s and 30s. And then in the 50s, what was the phrase she used? Like, it was like everybody went to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
And it-
Which is so powerful. Yeah, yeah, that stayed with me as well. Yeah, and there were many reasons that I set this novel in the 1950s. Partially it was because of my research. The book that was really the most helpful for me was this memoir called The Divorce Seekers. And if anybody leaves here at all interested in this time period, I highly recommend this memoir. It was written by this ranch hand, Bill McGee, who worked at the Flying ME, which was one of the most famous ranches in Reno at the time. And it's just this really incredible account of his time there. Like the amount of detail is amazing. And so because he was working there during this time period, I was like, gosh, so many of the images that I have in my head are directly lifted from this memoir. It felt like the right setting in that sense. But the more that I sat with it, I think it was also, the 1950s were such a bizarre time to be a woman. You talk about the 20s and 30s, and then it was also right on the cusp of World War II, when women were called to serve in so many ways. And, obviously they served as nurses during the war, and a lot of them took on positions that men held because men were away. And then all of a sudden they were told, all right, the men are back. It's time to resume your old role. It's time to go back to really being a wife and being a mother. And that sort of whiplash was something that I thought about a lot. And we all have the very stereotypical images of sort of Leave It to Beaver. And I think we have often a very superficial sense of what the 1950s were like, when actually, of course, like any decade of human existence, it was just as tumultuous and complicated as the times we're living through now. So yeah, there was a lot to explore.
Yeah, I could tell you did a lot of research for this.
Yes.
But it doesn't feel like, sometimes you'll read a book and it feels like the writer's like, you must know this because I found this from my research and it's interesting.
Yep.
So I'm going to jam it in here. It didn't feel like that at all. It
Oh,
all
good,
felt
good.
organic to the story, but there were a lot of really fascinating, interesting details that you could
Good.
really only come up with if you had done the deep dive. And also, did you read Better Luck Next Time?
Yes.
Yeah, my friend Julia Claiborne Johnson, she wrote a book called Better Luck Next Time, which is also about the divorce ranches. And her grandfather was a cowboy on the divorce ranch.
I didn't know
So
that.
the character in the book is based on her grandfather.
Oh my
So,
gosh, how amazing.
Yeah. So I was curious if you had read.
I'd read it, and it was one of those moments of terror that I feel like writers have sometimes, where I read it when I had finished a draft of the Divorcées, and I was like, oh God, someone's written my book, But it's a very different novel in so many ways, but it's a great book.
They're
Yeah.
two totally different books. I mean,
Very
there's
different.
a lot of books on the same topic that are
Yes,
told
yes.
differently. You can do that.
I know, my
Yeah.
panic was short-lived.
Yeah, that's great. Well, do you mind reading an excerpt from the book?
Yeah,
I
of
always love
course.
hearing in the author's voice, don't you guys? So,
So a section that I thought I would read, for those of you that haven't started the book, so I've mentioned the lead character is somebody named Lois Saunders, who's a very sheltered young woman, kind of an outsider. And at this point in the novel, she's been at the ranch for about a week. She, just like back home in Lake Forest, she feels very out of place. She's not really connecting with anybody. But a couple of days before this scene takes place, Greer, who at this point we don't know her name, she's just the new guest, arrives in the middle of the night. And Lois sees her from her bedroom window and notices that Greer has a really massive bruise on the side of her face. And then Greer, for a couple of days, basically retreats and kind of goes into hiding, stays in her room. And so all of the women are gossiping about her and think that she must be somebody of kind of incredible wealth and stature, that she's able to be in seclusion like that. So at the start of this scene, everybody else is out, but Lois sees Greer sitting by the pool. When the door clicks open, the new guest does not turn her head. She's wearing a large white Oxford, mostly unbuttoned, in the crisp cotton of a dress shirt. There's a sheen to the fabric, luminous as a pearl. Lois wears no cover-up, and her burgundy suit is hopelessly dated. The new guest's eyes are covered with a pair of tortoiseshell sunglasses, similar to the frames Mary Elizabeth sometimes wears. And beneath them, Lois can see the bruise has changed. It's mercurial, shifting like a skein of clouds, the colors slightly faded to lavender and a lichen green. Lois knows it would be too bold to take the seat next to her, but she doesn't want to distance herself by sitting in a chair at the pool's opposite edge. She's been waiting for the guest to appear for 3 days, and now that she's here, the fear of saying the wrong thing is pointed as a fractured bone. She decides on the water. To display her bravery, she dives right in, not slowly submerging her body up to her waist like she normally does. The water's cold is a shock, nearly religious, a feeling of being reborn. She swims to the edge and crests only to fill her lungs, kicking off the wall and swimming to the other end, picturing herself from the guest's vantage, her arms gracefully cutting through the water. She pushes herself harder, farther. Though she imagines herself being watched, when she finally stops to rest, she's startled to find the guest looking at her, perched on the lip of her chair, her ankle balanced on her knee. From this low angle, Lois can see she's not wearing a bathing suit. Between her thighs is a triangle of thin yellow underwear. She's watching Lois with a frank openness, and when their eyes meet, Lois's body is struck like a tuning fork. Without thinking, she takes in a massive breath and plunges to the pool's bottom. Her toes scrape against the stippled concrete. She opens her eyes, something she didn't know she could do until she was 11, when Ela threw pennies into a community pool and she dove to fetch them, slipping beneath the surface as cleanly as a seal, and looks upward. Sunshine ribbons through the water, and at the pool's edge, Lois can just make out the arch of the new guest's foot, though, like the bruise, the shape keeps shifting. Pressure builds in her chest, the tightness of held air. She wishes she could stay at the pool's bottom and just watch her, but instead she brings her body up to the sun. "Were you trying to drown yourself?" the new guest asks. Her voice is lower than Lois imagined, with a slight croak to each word, as if she's recovering from a cold. Lois wipes her eyes and shakes her head back and forth. She tries to take delicate, measured breaths, but her body needs great gasps. "No, that's part of my routine." "Really?" "Yes, quite a routine." The new guest leans back in her chair and closes her eyes. Lois rests herself out of the water. She wants to demonstrate an ease, but her labored breathing betrays her. A tremor lingers in her limbs. After reaching for her towel, she pats her face dry. Her makeup is running, rubs of peach and black sullying the cotton. The new guest's face is bare. She unfolds a newspaper, one arm crossed above her head. To Lois's surprise, a heavy comma of blood wets her thumbnail, as if she'd been gnawing at the skin. She doesn't wear a wedding ring. Lois looks back down at her thighs, trying not to stare. The sun bakes her neck and shoulders. She knows her skin will burn, can almost smell it, like the heady scent of a match catching flame. Wrapping herself in her towel, she stands in defeat, her feet unsteady in her leather slides, and walks over to the door. But when her fingers grip the handle, she remembers how she felt when the new guest emerged from the taxi's back seat, that sense of possibility, an opening, and she returns to the cluster of chairs. "I almost drowned once in Lake Michigan," Lois says, and the girl turns. "I got pulled out by a riptide. This old woman who was missing several of her bottom teeth saved me. She swam parallel and brought me back to shore, so I really wasn't trying to drown myself. I know what drowning feels like, and even if I wanted to end things, I'd choose another way of doing it." The new guest tilts her head, pushing up her sunglasses so they nestle in her hair like a crown. In the light, Lois can see the girl's eyes are a dark, deep green, like the pond in her father's backyard at the peak of summer. "It's unusual to be missing your bottom teeth and not your top." "I suppose," Lois says, trying to recall anyone else she's known with missing teeth. "And how would you end things if you had to choose?" "A gun. I'd want it to be quick." Lois is both surprised and calmed by the question, asked in the same manner as someone inquiring whether she preferred coffee or tea. "Me too." They continue to stare at one another, even as the moment of silence stretches. The girl's look is not one of judgment in the way Lois has experienced, not with the girls at the ranch or the countless others before that. There's no calculation, no appraisal of how Lois appears and sounds. She's not looking at her dated bathing suit or trying to discern if her words carry the flat nasal accent of Chicago's counter girls and waitresses. Instead, the girl seems to be watching her in the way Lois watches Marlene Dietrich in the first frames of a film, trying to decide what sort of character she'll be and whether or not to trust her. "What's your name?" the new guest asks. "I'm Lois Saunders, or well, Gorski now." "I'm Greer." Greer Lang, isn't it? Rita mentioned your last name at breakfast yesterday. That's my married name. I'm still using it for now. It draws less attention, though. Don't mention that to any of the other girls. I would never tell them anything about you. Greer smiles, the surprising warmth of which feels like syrup being poured down Lois's spine, and tips her sunglasses back over her eyes. She returns to her newspaper, giving it a shake to stiffen the pages. Lois waits to see if she'll say something else, but she continues to read, the smile lingering at the corners of her mouth.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.
That was a great scene that you, first of all, her body smelling like a match. That was such a great
Oh,
description.
thank you.
It was really interesting. I feel like I've been reading a lot of books lately, like Yellowface comes to mind, for example, where there's very little description. And I was thinking about a Mary Gateskill essay that I don't mean to get too wonky on this, but like I love like craft. But Mary Gateskill wrote this essay talking about how the kinds of writers that like John Updike and so on had used a lot more description to describe the world that they were looking at. And Mary Gateskill argues that younger people, younger writers, don't describe things as much because we have such a visual culture and everyone is on their phones and people don't feel like they need to have things described to them. It's like when I read Yellowface, I was startled at how little the characters in the setting were described. You weren't really quite sure where you even were, like what city you were in. And here that's unmistakable. It's so cinematic. I felt like you really lingered on a lot of the details to like bring us into the way you, having written a book set in Palm Springs recently, I was like, man, she's really got this nailed writing about the desert. And the characters felt like incredibly embodied. I mean, you're really in tune with Lois's. I felt like I was in her skin for most, and seeing the things that she saw. And I wonder if you could just talk about what that's like for you as a writer. When you're writing, are you always trying to do that? Like get yourself inside your character's skin and seeing the world through their eyes?
Definitely. I started writing poetry. That's actually my first love. And so I love descriptive language. It's definitely my weakness. And that's so much of describing the world is just so important to me. That's also the writing that I love to read, is that sort of writing that feels so deeply immersive and gives me a really clear sense of time and place, and also of the characters. And so, especially with this novel where, in the book itself, Lois, as you know, is really obsessed with film. She grows up, as I said before, a bit of an outsider, and really kind of her main point of connection with the larger outside world is through the movies that her mother takes her to see in the afternoons. And so because of that, the book isn't exactly from Lois's point of view. It's obviously not first person, but I knew that I wanted the description of the world to be cinematic, because that's in many ways how she sees setting, how she sees people, as almost as characters, which there's a mention of that here, to Marlene Dietrich. And so I'm so glad that you felt that, because I do feel like that was really important just to the overall vibe, for lack of a better word, of the book.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as writers, we're always trying to figure out how much of this world do we need to describe? How much do you leave up to the characters or the readers to figure out? And the writing that I grew up on is descriptive, and it's the writing that I was used to. So it was a nice return to feeling like, oh, I can see this, I can feel this. And it's just, I also felt that something that was really essential to the book, you were talking about, like, this is an experience women have. And I felt like it was important to be in a woman's body in this book, and to realize, like, not only the limitations that she faces from society, but from being female, and I loved how you didn't, like, you talk about like fibroids and periods, and like, it just felt very much like the situation that these women would have been in.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that, because so many wonderful writers and readers have read this book in different iterations and given me feedback. But I remember one piece of feedback I got at some point, and they were commenting on exactly that. They were like, this feels too modern. This doesn't feel like the 1950s. And I was like, women menstruated in the I hate to break it to you, but it's been going on a long time. But as you say, the experience of women is so central to the novel. And of course, there's, the ideology of what being a woman was like, and the sort of restraints that you face. But I think the physicality of it is so important too. And especially sometimes when different male characters are introduced in the novel, sometimes that sense of fragility or weakness that characters can feel in the face of male strength. I wanted the reader to feel that as well.
And even the feeling of like women, like I felt kind of like I was in high school, because these women are thrown together, and you guys know how women are, right? Like some of them are nice. She can do one thing wrong and suddenly she doesn't want to be around the other women because she feels like, well, what are they saying about me? And I thought Lois was a really interesting, flawed character. And I was curious, how did she come to mind, and how did you come up with all of her flaws and also her
Messiness.
strengths?
Yeah.
And then how she changes. She has a definite arc in the book.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, in many ways, like I do think of this like a coming of age novel. Lois in the book, she's about 22 years old, but as a character, she really went from her father's house at 18 directly to her husband's house. And so I thought of her as somebody who never really stood on her own 2 feet and who was kind of a teenager in certain ways in that sense. And Lois is from the North Shore of Chicago. My family moved to the North Shore of Chicago when I was about 8 years old. And I similarly always felt a little bit out of place, and like I could never kind of find my roots there.
So you started lying.
Exactly. So I just lied right and left to gain social acceptance. Yeah. Well, I feel like that those sorts of communities are so fascinating to me because from the outside they look incredibly homogenous, but on the inside, kind of what you're talking about, the conflicts that can erupt between women, there's so many tiny differences that can feel monumental. And Lois herself as a character, she comes from new money, which means that she's immediately marked as in a very different class than some of the other women, both at the ranch and back home in Lake Forest. So I did pull from some of my experiences growing up of just feeling like a bit of an outsider in that community. My family doesn't even have new money, so it was a whole other challenge. But so I knew I wanted her to be a bit of an outsider. Again, that sort of sense of teenage searching for self. And that was really important to me because I knew I wanted, for a novel that from the surface might look like it would be about romantic relationships, it's about the dissolution of marriages. I knew that I wanted a really complicated female friendship at the heart of it. And when I thought about, the two women that would be attracted to each other, I thought about somebody who would be, lacking in confidence, have a shaky sense of self. Of course, she would be drawn like a moth to a flame, who's somebody who has just this immediate confidence and magnetism. And so a lot of the novel was figuring out not just, Lois's attraction to Greer, but also what draws Greer to Lois and the sort of strengths that she has that you alluded to.
Well, and you also, like, one thing I love about the novel is when you write a young character who's in a state of transition and is just finding themselves, you can make bad decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we were talking about this at dinner, but sometimes I think readers are really hard on female characters who make bad decisions. Men can make all the bad decisions they want in fiction, but when women do, I think it's so important though to write about characters who are flawed and imperfect and who do stupid things. And especially in the 50s, like you can totally see how Lois would get sucked into. Am I giving anything away by saying that Lois can? I mean, everyone makes bad decisions. Oh, yeah. It doesn't matter with the book. Yeah, but I mean, she's not perfect.
No, she is not. Yeah,
yeah,
consistently throughout the novel. And yeah, I have been, I've heard some wonderful things from readers who are like, gosh, I so deeply connect with this person. And I saw some of myself in her, which has been so wonderful. But I've also heard from people who are just like, how could she be so stupid? She's just making mistakes left and right.
Oh,
and
I've been there. Yeah. I think we need to go out for drinks after this.
Yeah.
And
well, and I think about, not only am I still making mistakes at this age, but God, me at 22, like my life was a series of endless mistakes. And so, I'm always kind of shocked of how unforgiving people are of protagonists sometimes.
Yeah, my friend May Cobb wrote a book called A Likeable Woman after everyone said that in her first book, the characters were unlikable, or the female character was unlikable. And she's like, all right, I'm just going to go out and write a book called Unlikable Woman.
That's amazing. Oh my God.
Yeah. And I mean, personally, I like reading about people. I don't necessarily want to be friends with the protagonists of every book I read. Like I just
Yes,
want,
of
like, I like
course.
seeing like what happens when you throw someone into this sort of milieu and see what happens.
Yes. And I mean, drama comes from mistakes. You know, if we
Mhm.
all made
Yeah.
correct decisions, we'd lead pretty boring lives. So,
Right. Yeah. No, I love the book. I love how I had no idea where it was going. And
Oh,
so for those of you who haven't read it yet, has anyone read the book yet? Oh, great. Yeah. So, like all of a sudden you're like, whoa, here we go. So I wasn't anticipating that. And I love that. I
Oh,
love that
good,
it's
good.
not built into the book where you know ahead of time. And then you're just like, okay, well, let's just see how this plays out.
Yep. Yep. I know the ending. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a journey story.
Very much.
They start out in one place and end up in a different place. And it's about the ride.
Yes. Yes. And who they are at the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, as I get older, I think sometimes when I read books, like, I think when I was younger, I didn't believe that people had the capacity to change.
Mm.
And now that I'm getting older, I see it. Like I see
Yeah.
people change and I think that's what makes literature so moving is to see them actually becoming different.
Oh, for sure.
Did you know when you started, like writers will talk a lot about what's their character's arc. Like we want them to change. Did you know how Lois was going to change or how some of the other characters would? Or did that just kind of come as you were writing?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I was a poet. I also really have chiefly written short fiction. And so I was really intimidated to write a novel. I mean, I just had the basic question of
But
like,
it's so easy.
I know. Why was I so scared? Yeah.
Just write it.
Well, how I tricked myself into it was I basically, before I sat down to write the Divorcées, had this very elaborate spreadsheet of like, this is every single scene that is going to happen in this novel and what I'm going to write. And I kind of, I know.
Daniel and I are like,
Everybody has their
don't
own
say the word
processes.
spreadsheet.
I know. I'm a very odd writer in that sense. I love Excel. But I kind of tricked myself in that I was like, all right, each scene is a short story. And I know what each of these separate scenes is. And I just have to write 30 short stories. So I had a very thorough outline. I had this idea of who Lois was at the start and who I wanted her to be at the end. Of course, that veered wildly off course, both as I was writing it and then through revisions. And so, Lois, how she comes to the ending, kind of comes to her fully realized self. That took a lot of twists and turns. But I think throughout the writing process, I've always had a pretty strong sense of who she is. I think so much of the work was just making sure the reader could see that as well. Yeah.
Well, and I think we both love character-driven novels. I'm
Yes.
kind of guessing that's
Oh,
our jam. I've talked to writers who, for me, like characters are everything for my books. Like that's where all the juice is when I write. And I've talked to, I'm sure some of your writing friends have said this, like, well, I don't really care about the characters. They're just
Yes.
moving the plot along.
Yeah.
And I'm
like chess pieces on a board. Yes.
yeah, you can't say that. But I think we, Lois,
Oh,
this feels like
100%.
if character-driven stories are your thing, you'll love the Divorcées.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I want to make sure we have an opportunity for people to ask questions. So start thinking about it. I just have one other question
yeah,
for you.
of
You
course.
you hit on something you were saying about class, and I felt like it was really interesting to have it was kind of an interesting melting pot of class. And even
Yeah.
within, you knew that it was mostly wealthy women who could stay in the divorce ranch, but still there are all these different layers and social strata of class. And I love that. I love reading about class. And maybe you could just say a little bit about that too. I mean, you already did, but I'm just curious about.
I know it's so funny because it feels so like un-American to talk about class. I feel like when usually in that conversation we think more of like British society, but I do think, as I was saying before, there are really sharp divisions, and I mean, gosh, especially in the 1950s, especially amongst this sort of group of women, they all show up at the ranch, and that's kind of how they're measuring each other. Is they're comparing the different people they know from high society, and that's how they immediately know if somebody's one of them or if somebody's on the outside. Originally this novel, there's really like 6 women at the ranch, and then there's a couple of different women who work on the ranch. I think I had like 12 women originally. I had way too many characters in this book. And that was just because I had so many ideas and so many people I wanted to represent on the page. So I think that, what I tried to do in this final cast of characters and through the process of revision was, one, represent exactly what you're talking about. So those sorts of minute divisions and And, you know, as you kind of learn more about these women's stories, a lot of them have their own secrets that they're, you know, trying to conceal about their backgrounds that might not be exactly what you think it is when you first meet them as characters. But I also, through each of those characters, wanted to show the different reasons that women would be traveling to Reno at the time. You know, some of them are escaping abusive marriages. Some of them are escaping husbands who really can't be a financial head of a household. Some of them are immediately remarrying right after they get divorced. And then there are people like Lois who are radical in that they're separating from their husband simply because she's not in love with him anymore and she doesn't have a plan for after. So yeah, there's a lot of things I was taking into consideration when thinking about the different women that are in the final draft.
Were any of the women named after your friends?
I tried. What's so funny is one of my best friends, so Rita runs the ranch. One of my best friends in the world is named Rita. And I must have made that connection when I originally named her, but Rita in the novel just exists so separate for me that it wasn't until I handed the book to my friend where I was like, oh, there's a Rita. It's not you. It's not you. But yeah, have you done that? Have you named characters after friends?
Yeah, especially it was really fun when I wrote about Playboy bunnies because
Oh my
like I have
gosh.
like, you know, my
Incredible.
my like suburban friends and like they're like, oh, I'm a Playboy bunny.
Yeah. That's amazing. I
So,
would be
yeah.
so honored.
It was really fun. Yeah. It's a nice little Easter. We call them Easter eggs when you like plant little things in your book for people to see.
Yes,
So are there any Easter eggs that I mean, you probably shouldn't say, but maybe
I
there's like a little one
know.
that like if somebody reads, they might
That's
be like, I
great
heard her
question.
mention this and now I see it.
God, I feel so ashamed that there aren't.
It's-
Wow. You know, what's also true about the names is I ended up changing so many of them. I found them basically because I went to Social Security and I was like, you know, traced how old each woman was. And I was like, what were people naming children in 1929? But because there's so many characters, even names that were like one syllable, like even names that had something so superficially similar, I noticed that people would start to confuse the characters. So I spent so much time just trying to make the names sound different.
Oh, the time and effort we put into names. My friend Lauren Fox, who you guys probably know Lauren Fox from she's a conversationalist also in Boswell. But she's one of my dear friends, and sometimes when we're in a writing group, and sometimes I'll send her pages, and she'll be like, "Got to change name. This character is just not working with this name. You know,
Yes.
she needs to be Kitty." I'm like, Kitty. So yeah.
So funny. Sometimes readers just know instantly. They're like, that's not it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it changes everything. Like when you
It
change
really
names, it's really
does.
huge.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I can't wait for book 2 to see it. Christy.
Now I do feel like I need to honor you.
Yeah. Who has some questions? Yeah.
I was thinking that the passage that you read,
Mhm.
I grew up as a child.
Mm.
And y'all do. There's no mid-century. What I was struck with Lois was self-conscious.
Yes.
It's such, and
Oh, thank you.
so this is me age as a little bit younger. Is that still how we women behave?
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry to say yes. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe there's hope for Gen Z. Yeah.
At this point, when you
Yeah.
become invisible, and that's one.
That's I know. No, I believe it. Yes.
And it's really what.
Oh gosh, yeah. It's so funny.
Are you guys are going to drinks with us after?
Yeah, seriously, 100%. You know, that's so funny. My sister and I, we were hanging out last week and we were, she was very lovely and came to New York to a book event with me. And we were staying at a bar afterwards. And afterwards, we were both comparing notes and we were both saying how desperately we saw that there was a man alone sitting next to us. And we were like, please don't talk to us. For the love of God, don't talk to us. And we were like, God, I can't wait to be an age where I just never have to worry about that ever again. But yeah, that sort of self-consciousness, God, I think that plagues especially teenage girls, women in their early 20s at every age in the history of womankind. And that was something that was so important to me. And honestly, I have heard from some readers like, God, I felt uncomfortable reading it just because it does kind of bring you back to those teenage feelings of, oh, everybody's looking at me, and one misstep, I will have a black mark in my record, and nobody will want to talk to me anymore, or no man will be attracted to me, or no woman, or nobody will want to be friends with me. And that heightened state, even though it is uncomfortable to read, I did really want to capture it, because I think to understand Lois's entire journey throughout the course of the book, you have to understand how unsure of herself she is. And that does manifest in just that physical discomfort that sadly I think we all know kind of well. No, thank you.
And it's part of the power imbalance, and really
Yes.
all literature is about power.
So true. Yes. I know you could have asked me what my book was about. I could have just said power. Yeah.
Power.
That would have been the clean, sharp answer.
Well, you're still kind of towards the beginning of your tour.
That's-
So you
that's
still
true. Now I have it.
Yeah. You'll be talking about this book for years.
Exactly.
Is doing the works.
It is. God help me. Yes, I'm doing it again. And it's, yeah, exactly. It's so easy. I was like, why not? Yeah, exactly. I've got the spreadsheet. And it's so funny. I really never thought I'd write historical fiction. And my mother takes great offense at this book being called historical fiction, because she was born 2 years before it started. And she's like, this isn't historical fiction. So who knows when something becomes historical fiction. But I never thought I'd write it. And definitely after I finished The Divorcées, I was like, I'm never doing this again. Of course, there's incredible joy in research. I was so fascinated by this time and place, and I loved reading about it. But often when I was writing it, there'd be a moment where I'm like, ugh, was sunscreen invented? Like there's just so many things you're constantly looking up that just sometimes disrupt your flow and your writing. And so I was like, never doing this again. But the new novel I'm working on, it's set in the 1970s. So I'm slowly inching closer to contemporary times. But I've always wanted to write a book set over the course of a wedding weekend. I really love condensed timelines. And when I got married, I was just kind of struck by the dramatic potential of a wedding weekend. It's like everybody you've ever known and loved in every iteration, all under one roof. And, luckily, I think everybody was happy that my husband and I were getting married, but I've been to weddings where people are not happy that the couple is getting married. And that feels like its own lit match. So it's, yeah, that's what's brewing. We'll see. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Oh, of course.
And then second, I'm actually working on a condensed timeline. So I know what your favorite.
Oh gosh, yes. Yes, yeah. Well, I'll start there because two come to mind for me. One is actually a book that I read that kind of inspired this new book, which is called Seating Arrangements by Maggie Shipstead. Also takes place over the course of a wedding weekend, multiple perspectives. It's great. And then another one that I love is Real Life by Brandon Taylor, which just takes place over the course of a weekend. It's about this graduate student. I forget what city. It's Midwestern. But it's just kind of, gosh, it's kind of hard to do an elevator pitch for it because it sounds like it could potentially be uninteresting, but it's so rich and so fascinating.
Yeah.
You've read it as well.
Well, and Daniel and I, we've chatted about this before, about what
really?
city it's in.
Yeah. Do they name the city or is it?
Yeah.
It's Madison.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's where I live.
Oh my
So-
gosh. Oh, of
Yeah.
course. I had to
Yeah.
back of my head. I was like, I feel like it's Wisconsin. All right.
Yeah.
Glad that's
Yeah.
confirmed. And in terms of, gosh, my publication journey, I was just sharing at dinner, my book went out to publishers the day before I gave birth to my daughter, to my first child. And I recommend it because I feel like the time in my life when I would have been obsessively refreshing my inbox to find out, has any editor read it? I was like, I need to keep this life alive. Like, I cannot worry about this right now. I was so distracted. So it's been a very intense emotional publication journey because I do feel like I've had these two major life events running in parallel, which is my daughter growing up and this book being out in the world. But my publisher is Flatiron and they are so wonderful. It's just an incredible group of people that just love books, and they've been so generous and supportive. I will say, going from, I feel like sometimes when people talk about the parallels between, some people say like my book baby, I never quite understand that. Partially because nobody is as judgmental of my child as they are of my daughter.
Yep.
And my child, I mean my book. But the book going from this thing that I felt so close to for so long, it was just mine and mine alone, kind of in the way like my daughter was just mine and mine alone for this period of time. And then all of a sudden being something that's out in the world. And I felt just immediate terror on publication day. I was just like, oh my God, now everybody that I know is going to read this, strangers are going to read this. What if they don't connect with it? Should I even be doing this? And then I don't know, over the past couple of weeks since it's been published, after that initial feeling of terror, I have just felt like real joy. And there's something really liberatory about it, about being like, all right, it's not mine anymore. Like it's out in the world, and readers have ownership over it too, and they're bringing meaning to it. I mean, even what you said about luminol, I was like, oh my gosh, that's perfect. Like I didn't think about that the name of that drug is so close to liminality. Like what a beautiful connection.
That's why I'm a great conversation.
I mean, the best. Yeah. But things like that, and just hearing from people, I've heard from people whose mothers traveled to Reno, and they were like, gosh, I hadn't really thought about what that period was like for her, and I feel closer to her now after reading that book. I mean, that's been such a joy. So yeah, I mean, it's been a real emotional roller coaster, but now I feel really just 98% joy, 2% still terror.
What's interesting, I've posted your book in anticipation of our event on Instagram. And so some of my friends who've recently gone through divorces are like, I need this book.
Oh,
this is my book. And I'm like, wow, I wonder if people think you're like,
yes.
well, here I am, like I'm the world's authority on divorce.
I know. I have gotten that of people, which has been wonderful to like have people be like, I'm just going through this and I think this will be helpful. I do have people who've been like, have you been through this too? And I'm like, oh, I haven't. I'm a
Didn't
child.
do that for research.
I know. I posed it to my husband at some point, and he was like, hard no. But I'm a child of divorced parents. I have so many people that I love who are close to me in my life who have been through divorce, who I interviewed, while writing this book. And I hope that people that have been through that do find a point of connection there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, every woman has a different reason
Yes.
for wanting to shake off their ex. So
Yeah. True.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, great.
I noticed, talking a lot about characters. I saw there's one show around
Oh, yes.
as that evolved throughout the book. Like, where did that
Yeah. I'm so glad you noticed that. Yeah. So throughout the novel, when Lois first arrives at the ranch, she, like, I think many women like feels very self-conscious eating. She's aware that the other women are just kind of picking delicately at their plates. And even though she feels like she comes to the table starving, she's like, well, I don't want to eat like a ranch hand, I'll kind of mirror everybody else at the ranch. And there is this shift that happens when Greer arrives, where she's basically like, I'm hungry, I'm eating. And she does eat what I think could be traditionally thought of as like more masculine. Like she's very focused on eating a steak and and having, a plate of scrambled eggs in the morning. And slowly sort of the women adopt that. And it is, I was hoping that it would be a reflection of sort of the larger push that Greer has for these women at the ranch, is for them to see different paths that are open to them, to sort of find their own inner strength, which, through the food that they're eating is transformed into outer strength. And there's a lot of description throughout the book of Lois herself just feeling not only mentally, but physically stronger, because she feels like she's finally able to satisfy her hunger. So I'm glad you noticed that. I had somebody at some point say, like, God, the women are just starving themselves throughout this entire book. And I was like, no, they're not. It's a very different shift. So anyway, that was kind of another manifestation of that influence from Greer. But thanks for noticing. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad.
Well, and there's that whole question of body image,
Yes.
and
Oh, of course.
yeah, it was really apt. When I was researching the Playboy Bunny story, I was shocked at all the diets that the women went on, and so like at
Only imagine.
at one point, Sherry's mouth is filled with canker sores because she's just been on the grapefruit diet for so long, and I was like that, and that's what they did.
Yeah.
Nobody
that was
ate.
it.
I mean, food
Yeah,
really,
imagine.
food. I mean, that's just such an important detail in the book.
Oh,
that
definitely.
it reveals so much about the characters, how their relationship
Yes.
to food.
And it just says what they think about their own bodies and the level of comfort they have.
And so now if you have a book club and you're hosting, you can have tons of food like
That's true.
steak and
Roast chicken.
ham and
yeah.
yeah.
Pork loin.
And just
yep.
tell everyone, just dig in, ladies. We're going to talk
Exactly.
about this
It's in
book.
the spirit of the Divorcées.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that. Any other questions? Yeah.
It's set in 1951. Oh, great question. So it's set over just 6 weeks, but then gosh, it's so hard not to give away the ending of your own book. Then then there is some time after as well. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
One other question for me. You said you're working on a second book. Are you using that horrible spreadsheet again?
I hate to break it to you, but I am.
Wow.
Yes. Though it's very funny because I use a spreadsheet, but I actually handwrite. I'm somebody
Mhm.
that writes longhand.
Do you really?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a very funny, I feel like that always confuses people that I both use an Excel spreadsheet and then write in a notebook.
Can you tell me about how that works for like at what point do you just type word for word or do you change it as you're typing?
I find
Like
that it's
how-
just really helpful editing because so basically when I'm done with a chapter, then I go and I type it up. But in that process, I'll be like, oh gosh, no, I don't actually need this line of dialogue, or I'll cut a metaphor. It's almost like I do feel like and there are studies that say this, that writing longhand just accesses a different part of your brain. And so I find that I'm almost able to see it from a different perspective, that then when I'm, typing it up, it's almost like I'm not exactly a different person. That's too extreme, but like it is, I'm able to bring a really fresh set of eyes to it in a way that I'm not when I'm just typing the original draft and then, editing it on the same manuscript.
It's so fascinating. I've tried doing the
Yeah.
longhand and I just can't I think once you get used to writing a certain way, it's
I
really
get
hard to
it.
break out of that.
Yeah.
But I love that. And so do you write a whole chapter and then
Yes.
type it, or is it you could write a couple paragraphs? And
No,
pop
I
'em in?
have to do the whole chapter. I also think it teaches me economy, because there really is a point where I'm like, my hand is tired. And like maybe the scene should end here. And sometimes I'm like, and it should, so I don't know. But I understand it's so hard
Yeah.
to shift when you kind of have the way that your brain works in that creative flow.
I'll try it. I was sitting right in this chair interviewing Rowan Beaird when he was here for Jackie and me, and we were chatting, and he writes this whole novel only in dialogue. And then he goes
Really?
back and he adds the exposition after
my
he's done with the
gosh.
dialogue. And he said he's written every book that way. And I tried doing that with my book. I was like, well, I'll give this a
Interesting.
try, and I couldn't do it.
You
But,
couldn't do it?
but maybe, I mean, it's fun to try these writing exercises. I'm sure there are a
Yeah.
lot of aspiring writers here, and or even if you're not, you could just go home and try to write a short story in dialogue or write a chapter in a
That'd
book.
be so
and-
interesting. I can
Yeah.
imagine the dialogue would be really incredible because you're just so focused on that back and forth between people. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of keeps things moving, and
Exactly.
you learn so much. I kind of feel like at a certain point, when you really get to know your character, they start talking back to you,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah, being locked into that. How cool.
Well,
I'm going to try it.
yeah. Well, Rowan, I was just raving about Boswell, and I'm so happy
Oh,
you're
gosh.
here to see this wonderful place and be in this great store. And I loved hearing about your book. It was so much fun to read. And for those of you who haven't bought it yet, there's going to be a signing line, and you can have Rowan sign it. Mother's Day is coming. Father's Day is
Yes.
coming.
Yeah, for the
Yeah.
kids as well.
Yeah. I actually think signed books would make the perfect gifts.
Oh,
So,
totally agree.
and I'm not just saying that because we're here, but I mean, I am saying that because we're here.
Yeah. Well, thank
Yeah,
you so much.
of
This was
course,
so
it's
wonderful.
okay.
And thank you all again for coming. And thank you so much to Boswell for
Yeah.
hosting me. This was so great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.